I watched my wedding dress burn in my own backyard. My daughter-in-law laughed, toasting the flames with my wine, and my son, my only child, just sat there saying nothing. Not a protest, not a glance. After 52 years of being his mother, I was just another thing to throw away. They didn't light a fire, they buried me in it. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The smell reached Irene before the sight. Not the comforting curl of hickory or mesquite, the kind neighbors used for weekend barbecues. No, this smoke carried sweetness and rot, fabric fibers giving way to flame. It clung in her throat, a smell she recognized instantly from decades at her sewing machine. The faint whiff of scorched thread, only multiplied 1,000 times. Her keys froze in her hand as she stood at the edge of her driveway. The evening air was still heavy with August heat. The only movement came from the thin column of gray rising above the roofline, drifting into the cloudless Oklahoma sky. She forced her steps forward, her sandals pressing into the path of stone pavers she and her late husband had laid together 20 years earlier. Every step seemed to echo in her bones. By the time she rounded the corner of the red brick ranch, the source came into view. The backyard fire pit glowed with a greedy orange center. Amber reclined in a chair beside it, wine glass balanced like a trophy in her hand, her laughter cutting across the yard with a shrillness that didn't belong to this house. Bryce sat nearby, shoulders slumped, his posture as defeated as a man bracing for a fight he would never take on. But Irene's eyes didn't rest on them. They locked onto the fire. Something pale collapsed inward, blackening in folds, a slow-motion collapse of lace into ash. Satin rippled as it caught, shriveling under tongues of flame. Her breath left her body in one sharp, soundless exhale. The dress, she knew it instantly, even as it disappeared. She saw the careful stitches she had made as a girl of 20, the hand-sewn beading she'd added after long shifts at the diner, the gown she had carried down the aisle toward the only man she'd ever loved. The years she kept it wrapped in tissue, tucked away as carefully as a relic, not for any future bride but for memory alone. That dress had outlasted his heart attacks, his burial, every holiday spent alone. Until now. Amber noticed her staring and smirked, lifting her glass. That old thing. It was cluttering the closet. Honestly, Irene, I did you a favor. The words floated out carelessly, cruel in their lightness. Bryce shifted, eyes on the fire instead of his mother. His voice came low, almost apologetic, but not enough. It was falling apart anyway. What's the point of keeping it? Irene's grip tightened on the pergola post, her knuckles whitening against the wood. She wanted to step forward, to drag the satin carcass from the flames, to make them both see what they had destroyed. But she didn't move, didn't scream, didn't let them glimpse even a crack in her composure. The fire crackled, devouring the last recognizable scrap of lace. A bead popped, exploding like a gunshot before melting into nothing. Amber laughed again, tossing back her wine, while Bryce stared at his shoes. Irene turned on her heel and walked back into the house. Her sandals tapped steady against the stones, the rhythm of a woman refusing to stumble. Inside, the air was cooler, filtered through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. She placed her purse on the counter with meticulous care, slipped off her jacket, folded it once, twice, then draped it neatly over the back of a chair. Her kitchen clock ticked softly. She listened to it for a full minute, steadying her breathing. The house smelled faintly of lavender polish, not smoke, and for that she was grateful. She needed this stillness. At last she lifted the phone from its cradle. The cord curled loosely between her fingers as she dialed numbers she hadn't needed to look up in decades. Her hand was steady, the digits pressed with precision. On the third ring, Ruth's voice answered, brisk and familiar. "Well, aren't you calling early for a Tuesday?" Irene's reply came low, almost inaudible, but sharp as a needle. "She burned my dress. The one I wore when I married his father." The silence on the other end was heavy, charged. the kind that preceded storms. Ruth Delgado's car screeched into the driveway before Irene had even finished setting the kettle on the stove. The old Buick's headlights cut across the windows, and seconds later the slam of a door shook the quiet. Irene didn't flinch. She moved with deliberate calm, pulling two china cups from the cabinet, the ones with blue forget-me-nots her husband had given her on their 30th anniversary. The front door banged open without ceremony. Ruth's voice stormed in before her feet did. "Tell me I heard you wrong, Irene. Tell me she didn't do it." "She did." Irene's voice was steady, almost eerily so. She poured hot water over the tea leaves, the steam fogging her glasses for a moment. Ruth barreled into the kitchen, cheeks flushed, hair tousled like she'd driven with the window down. She braced herself against the counter, eyes sharp. "That woman has been circling like a buzzard since the day she married your boy, but I never thought, Lord help me, I never thought she'd be dumb enough to torch the one thing she couldn't replace." Irene set a cup before her. "Sit, Ruth. You'll give yourself a stroke." But Ruth didn't sit. Not yet. She paced, muttering curses under her breath, until finally she dropped into the chair with a huff, gripping the porcelain cup as though it were a weapon. Irene rose and walked to the hallway. A soft click of hinges echoed as she opened the cedar hope chest she had guarded for half a century. From inside she lifted items one by one, a pair of satin gloves, still ivory though the elastic had long gone slack, a veil folded so neatly its edges looked ironed, the garter she had once hidden with girlish embarrassment. She spread them across the dining table with careful hands, each artifact laid out like evidence in a trial. The photos came last. Sepia, black and white, glossy color spanning decades of Callaway history. Her husband smiling at her beneath the church steeple. Bryce as a baby in her arms, his fist gripping the hem of that very dress. A family built on stitches and thread, now reduced to ash in the backyard pit. Ruth reached for one photo and pressed it flat, her lips tightening. Amber wouldn't know the value of this if it smacked her in the face. To her, it's just junk. She's always seen my house that way. Irene lowered herself into the opposite chair, her hands wrapped around her tea though she didn't drink. Every time she visits, she calls something dated. Says I should sell, donate, modernize. Last month she said my quilts were depressing. Ruth let out a humorless laugh. That's rich. You could cover half of Tulsa with those quilts and still not stitch up her ego. The room filled with silence for a beat, only the clock ticking on the wall. Then Irene opened the drawer beneath the sideboard and pulled out a thick folder, its tab labeled in her neat script, Estate. She laid it flat and slid it across the table. Ruth's eyes widened. "You've been updating?" "Not recently." Irene flipped the cover open, revealing wills, deeds, bank documents. Every line still tied her assets, her house, her savings to Bryce, and by extension to Amber. As of now, it all still goes to him. Ruth's jaw tightened. She leaned forward, voice low but cutting. "Then it's time you stop letting them write the story. Time to write the ending you actually want." The words landed like a gavel strike. Irene felt the truth of them reverberate through her chest. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself to exhale fully. She reached for the phone again. This time there was no trembling, no hesitation. Her fingers dialed a number she hadn't called in years, but had never forgotten. The ring was short, efficient. A man's voice answered, warm but professional. "Eric Banner." Irene closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, then spoke. "Eric, it's Irene Callaway." On the other end a pause, then his calm, deliberate words, "If you're calling, something serious must have happened." The office smelled faintly of leather and old paper, a blend that reminded Irene of library stacks and men who measured their words carefully. The blinds were half drawn against the afternoon sun, slats of light cutting across the walnut desk where Eric Banner sat waiting. His office was lined wall to wall with books, law, history, philosophy, each spine worn down by use. It was the kind of room that swallowed noise, insisting on seriousness. Irene sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't fidget. She didn't blink away tears. She just sat, her posture as straight as the oak chairs they rested in. Eric leaned back, studying her face in silence for longer than most would dare. He was tall, silver-haired, with the calm gaze of someone who had seen too many family wars to be surprised by much. But there was something in Irene's expression that made him tilt his head, like a chess master recognizing the shape of a rare opening move. Finally he spoke. "You wouldn't have called me if this was something small. Tell me what happened," she told him, not with theatrics or rage, but with clinical detail. The smoke, the satin, Amber's laugh, each word laid down like evidence in court. Eric didn't interrupt once. He listened, fingers steepled, his face giving away nothing except the faint tightening around his jaw when she reached the part about Bryce shrugging. When she finished, the silence between them stretched. The clock on the bookshelf ticked softly, a steady counterpoint to the storm gathering outside the windows. At last, Eric leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "I recommend full revocation." The words landed with a finality that made Ruth, perched on the sofa nearby, let out a short, satisfied exhale. Irene didn't move, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Full revocation," she repeated, testing the sound. "Yes," Eric said. "Not an amendment, not a codicil, a complete reset. We erase their claim entirely and build something new from the ground up." Ruth shifted, her tone biting. "Amber'll choke on her Chardonnay when she hears." But Irene didn't smile. She pressed her palm flat against the desk, anchoring herself. "Show me how." Within minutes, Eric pulled a fresh stack of draft papers from his cabinet. He slid them across the desk, his pen already uncapped. The process began not with anger, but with precision. First came the exclusions. Amber Calloway, explicitly disinherited, with wording sharp enough to cut through any challenge she might attempt. Then Bryce. Irene's pen hesitated before touching his name. Eric's tone softened. "You can remove him entirely, but if you want accountability, there are measures." "What kind of measures?" "A conditional trust. He only receives funds if he completes monthly behavioral check-ins with a third-party trustee. Financial counseling. Substance screenings if needed. Proof of stable employment. If he fails even once, he forfeits everything." Ruth leaned forward, eyes glittering. "Make him earn it." Lord knows he never lifted a finger when it mattered. Irene set her pen down for a moment. Her silence was sharp, almost painful. Finally, she nodded once. "Conditional trust. Do it." Next came the executor. Eric suggested options, but Irene already knew. "Ruth," she said simply. Ruth blinked. "Me? You've been beside me since I was 12. If anyone will guard this, it's you." For the first time all afternoon, Ruth looked rattled. She cleared her throat and covered it with sarcasm. "Well, hell, Irene, now I'll have to buy a power suit." Eric allowed himself the faintest smile, then turned the page. "Any legacy gifts?" "Yes." Irene's eyes flicked to a photograph on Eric's bookshelf of a young law student shaking hands with a judge. She spoke slowly. "A discretionary fund for textile scholarships, for seamstresses, designers, anyone who wants to carry the craft forward. They'll need tools, they'll need a chance." Eric wrote it down, ink against paper, quiet and deliberate. When the drafting was finished, Irene placed her signature at the bottom of each page with steady hands. Ruth hovered close, her presence like a shield. The smell of ink, paper, and old wood mingled with something sharper, the air of change. Eric gathered the signed drafts and tapped them into alignment. He looked across the desk, his eyes steady on Irene. "Do you want to file the amendment first thing tomorrow?" The pen made no sound against the paper, yet the moment carried the weight of thunder. Irene Calloway lowered her name onto each page, letter by letter, as though she were carving them into stone. Her hand did not shake, not once. Ruth stood behind her, arms crossed, lips pursed in quiet satisfaction. Eric Banner watched from across the desk, nodding each time Irene slid another document forward. He was a man accustomed to hesitation, to trembling clients second-guessing themselves. Irene gave him none of that. Each stroke of ink was steady, decisive, final. When the last page lay signed, Eric gathered the stack, pressed his notary seal into the thick paper, and stamped with firm precision. The sound echoed in the quiet office. "There," he said softly. "It's official." Ruth let out a low whistle. About time someone put that woman in her place. Irene didn't answer. She stood adjusting her cardigan, her posture tall and unbroken. The air in the office smelled faintly of leather and lemon oil, and for once it matched the atmosphere, clean, sharp, irreversible. Within hours, Eric filed the updates himself, sending electronic confirmations that pinged into Irene's inbox before she had even returned home. The documents were airtight. Bryce had conditions. Amber had nothing. For the first time since the fire pit, Irene breathed easily. That peace lasted only a day. Amber's latest conquest appeared not at Irene's door but online. On her carefully curated social media page, she posted a photo of herself standing smugly in the walk-in closet Irene had once filled with family garments. The caption read, "Decluttering feels divine. Out with the old, in with the minimalist chic." Rows of plastic hangers gleamed behind her, each gap where a history had once lived. Ruth sent Irene the screenshot with no comment, only the rolling eyes emoji. Against her better judgment, Irene clicked the thread. Dozens of Amber's friends chimed in. "So sleek. Love this vibe. Finally space for what matters." And then, buried in the comments, Ruth's voice cut like a blade. "Some things shouldn't be touched." Amber didn't reply. But Irene could almost hear her scoff, the same one she used whenever she dismissed anything older than last season's handbags. The next morning, Irene folded garments into tissue paper with careful, practiced hands. Dresses she had kept not for Amber, not for Bryce, but because they carried the fingerprints of decades. The hem she fixed the night her husband got his promotion. The jacket she wore to her first quilting showcase. The cocktail dress that had survived more than one New Year's Eve. She packed them neatly into garment bags, the cedar scent rising faintly as she zipped them closed. Ruth arrived with her Buick trunk already cleared. Together they drove into Tulsa, the city's summer heat wavering off the pavement. Their destination, Trina Park's boutique, a narrow brick storefront nestled between a wine bar and a jewelry shop. The windows displayed mannequins dressed in vintage gowns, each lit as though on stage. Trina herself greeted them at the door, a slender woman with sharp eyes, softened by her quick smile. "Mrs. Calloway," she said warmly. "I wasn't expecting you." "You weren't," Irene replied, lifting one of the garment bags onto the counter. When Trina unzipped the first bag, the smile slid from her face. She lifted the dress out carefully, running her fingers across the stitching, the fabric's heavy drape. Her mouth parted in disbelief. "These," she began, voice hushed. "These are worth thousands. Collectors would line up for pieces like this." Ruth grinned, watching Irene's still expression. "Told you she'd faint," but Irene remained steady, her gaze fixed on the rows of mannequins lining the boutique. "Good," she said finally, her voice even deliberate. "Let that dress be the last thing she ever burned." The dining room table glowed beneath the soft lamplight, every inch covered with photographs and letters. Black and white snapshots of a young couple dancing, faded Polaroids of birthdays, barbecues, and summers at Grand Lake. Letters yellowed at the folds, written in her husband's careful cursive. Ruth sat across from Irene, her laptop open, fingers clacking as she scanned each piece into digital folders. "Smile, Harold Calloway," Ruth muttered at one photograph. "Your girl's making sure they'll never erase you." Irene pressed another envelope flat, smoothing its edges with the side of her hand. The cedar scent from the hope chest lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of Ruth's coffee. The room felt alive, almost reverent, as though each keystroke and scan was a prayer said out loud. By midnight, neat folders filled the screen: wedding family, quilts Harold. Irene slipped her glasses off, rubbing her eyes, but there was no fatigue in her expression. "It won't die with a fire pit," she murmured. The next morning, Irene sat at her desk and drafted a message to her alma mater's foundation office. Her email was direct, no wasted words, establishing scholarship fund for textile arts, initial endowment attached, details forthcoming. With a single click, she sent it into the world, her legacy shifting course. Later that afternoon, Eric's call came. His tone was calm, almost pleased. It's done, Irene. The assets are secured inside an irrevocable trust. No one touches a dime without the terms you set. Not Amber, not Bryce, not anyone. For the first time in weeks, Irene allowed herself the smallest smile. Good, she said simply. But good things never stayed hidden for long. The confrontation came the following morning at breakfast. The smell of buttered toast filled the kitchen, and Irene sat alone at the table, spreading orange marmalade with deliberate slowness. The front door opened without knocking. Amber's perfume arrived first, sharp and cloying, followed by the clipped rhythm of heels across the tile. Amber slammed a printout on the table, nearly upsetting Irene's teacup. Donations? Scholarships. What is this, Irene? Bryce trailed behind her, avoiding his mother's gaze, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Irene glanced at the papers without touching them. That, she said, voice even, is the future. One you'll never hold. Amber's laugh came brittle. You're throwing away everything. His house, his savings, our inheritance on strangers with sewing machines. Do you have any idea how insane this looks? Irene placed her knife neatly on the plate. Her tone sharpened, quiet but cutting. You lit the match. I'm just watching it burn. Amber's jaw dropped, her face flushing crimson. Bryce stepped forward quickly, hands raised in a useless gesture of peace. Mom, please. She made a mistake. A bad one, yes, but just a mistake. Don't punish us like this. Ruth's voice, though not physically in the room, echoed in Irene's memory. Time to write the ending you actually want. Irene turned her gaze on her son, her expression unreadable. Mistakes, she said slowly. The syllables weighted with finality. Don't come with deeds and bank accounts. Amber's grip on the countertop whitened. Bryce's mouth fell open, and the kitchen seemed to hold its breath, because Irene's words weren't just a warning, they were a verdict. Amber Calloway's nails clicked against her phone screen, her lips pursed in concentration. She sat at the marble counter of her kitchen, wine glass half full, Bryce hovering nervously by the fridge. The online banking app, loaded with its familiar blue and white logo. She typed the transfer amount with smug satisfaction, 10,000, a fraction of what she thought they deserved, but enough to make her feel in control again. She pressed submit. A red error box flashed. Denied. User not authorized. Amber blinked, tried again, a smaller amount this time. The same error. What the hell? Her voice climbed, brittle and sharp. She thrust the phone at Bryce. You linked me wrong. Fix it. Bryce stared at the screen, confusion etched on his face. It's not wrong. I've used this account 100 times. Mom. He stopped himself, swallowing. She must have. Amber's chair screeched back across the tile. She cut you out. And she had. Days earlier, Irene had quietly walked into her credit union, documents in hand, and removed Bryce's name from every joint account tied to her estate. What once had been a safety net for her son and his wife was now locked, unreachable. Amber paced the kitchen, her heels cracking against the floor. We can't even touch our own future. She's unraveling everything. Bryce's shoulders sagged. He rubbed his temples, voice barely audible. It was never ours to touch. The same weekend, Tulsa's boutique district came alive. Trina Park had pulled every string for Irene Calloway's collection debut. The shop glowed with warm Edison lights, glass cases polished to a shine. Gowns and dresses lined the displays, each one tagged not with a price but with a story. Stitched dates, photographs, histories printed on cream cardstock. Guests arrived in waves, the hum of admiration filling the air. The scent of champagne and lavender-scented candles mingled, clashing but pleasant. The soft thrum of jazz played from a corner speaker, and Irene stood near the entrance, a quiet pillar in her slate gray dress, Ruth at her side. Trina introduced her with reverence. Tulsa's very own seamstress of legacy. Every piece tonight honors decades of craft, and every dollar raised, she added, voice carrying through the shop, goes directly into the Callaway Scholarship Trust. Applause rippled. Irene inclined her head, not smiling, but her eyes softened at the students in the back, eager young designers clutching their sketch pads. The register chimed steadily as collectors bought garments, their checks written not to Irene but directly to the fund. By evening's end, the trust had swelled with more money than Amber could have imagined. Ruth bustled over, newspaper in hand, her grin sharp. Look at this, Irene. She unfolded the Tulsa World with a snap. On the front page of the lifestyle section, a headline sprawled in bold, Vintage Seamstress Creates Fashion Legacy. A photo accompanied it, Trina smiling beside Irene, who stood stone-faced but dignified, lace shawl draped over her shoulders. Beneath it, a quote, "She lost one dress. She gave back 1,000 more." Ruth tapped the print. Now that's a burn. Amber can't outdrink. Irene folded the paper neatly, tucking it into her bag. History belongs to the one who writes it. From across the street, Amber watched. She stood on Irene's porch, arms crossed, her expression sour as guest after guest stepped into Trina's boutique. Each cheer of laughter and pop of cork carried across the summer air, salt in her wound. She glared at the front windows, at the silhouettes of women admiring Irene's gowns, at the sight of her mother-in-law treated not as a relic, but as a matriarch. Bryce appeared beside her, phone buzzing in his pocket. He pulled it out, hesitated, then typed with trembling thumbs. Minutes later, Irene's phone lit up where it rested in her handbag. She glanced at the message, her expression unreadable. "Bryce, you're breaking this family apart." She read it twice, her jaw tightening, then typed her response with deliberate care. "E didn't burn anything." She did. One tap, and it was gone. The kitchen was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Irene set the phone face down on the counter and reached for her tea, its steam curling against the dim light. She didn't wait for a reply. Some words didn't need answers. The following morning, Ruth arrived with her laptop tucked under her arm, her stride brisk. She dropped into the dining chair across from Irene and powered it on. "If Amber thinks she can smear you online, we're beating her to it. Time to make this fund impossible to twist." Irene adjusted her glasses, sliding a folder of notes across the table. "The scholarships aren't about me, they're about the students, which is exactly why we need a statement," Ruth countered. Her fingers tapped the keys. "We keep it clean, professional, airtight. You don't have to say her name. People already know the difference between a legacy and a tantrum." Together they crafted the message for the scholarship's website. The Callaway Fund exists to honor craft, resilience, and memory. It transforms loss into opportunity for future makers. When Ruth read it aloud, Irene gave a single approving nod. "That'll outlive any gossip Amber throws," Ruth said, satisfied. The first scholarship disbursement ceremony took place in the college's textile studio. Students in handmade outfits gathered, cameras flashing as checks were awarded. Irene sat in the front row, Ruth beside her, watching faces light up with possibility. The air smelled of starch, fabric dye, and nerves. Notably absent were Bryce and Amber. No invitation had been sent. Their absence, though unspoken, was a presence in itself, like two chairs left deliberately empty at a family table. One student, holding her check with trembling hands, leaned down to whisper, "Thank you, Mrs. Callaway. My grandmother was a seamstress too. You have no idea what this means." Irene touched her hand lightly. "Yes, I do." That evening, Eric Banner forwarded an email to Irene's inbox. The subject line read, "Potential Contest." She clicked it open. From Amber Callaway. Subject: Notice of Intent to Challenge. Claim improper influence and unjust disinheritance. Eric's note at the top was succinct. "Don't worry. Empty threats are louder than valid ones. Still, we'll prepare." Ruth, reading over Irene's shoulder, let out a bark of laughter. She really thinks she can march into a courtroom with her Chardonnay breath and win against Eric Banner. That woman's dumber than I thought. Irene didn't laugh. She pulled a small recorder from her desk drawer, checked the batteries and pressed record. Her voice, calm and steady, filled the room. This is Irene Calloway. I am of sound mind and body. Any suggestion otherwise is false. Ruth raised her eyebrows. You're pre-recording? Insurance, Irene replied. She placed the recorder back in the drawer and began drafting several more statements, each precise, each dated. Ruth leaned back, crossing her arms. They forgot you outlived 3 recessions and cancer. You don't scare easy. No, Irene said quietly. I don't. 2 days later, a courier knocked at her door. Irene accepted the envelope, the heavy paper sealed with official ink. She slid it open with a letter opener, eyes scanning the text, her breath stilled. Filed with the Tulsa County Court. Petition claiming Irene Calloway mentally unfit to manage her estate. The courthouse envelope still lay on Irene's desk when she walked into the psychiatrist's office 3 mornings later. She had dressed with meticulous care, pressed slacks, pearl earrings, hair smoothed and pinned. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and peppermint tea, a strangely calm pairing. Dr. Elaine Porter greeted her with a firm handshake. Mrs. Calloway, thank you for coming. This won't take long. Irene nodded once, her gaze steady. Let's get it done. The evaluation began with memory exercises, word associations, and problem-solving tests. Dr. Porter asked her to recall lists of objects, trace patterns, and count backward by 7s. Irene's pencil moved briskly, her voice clipped but clear. At one point, the doctor leaned in. Can you tell me today's date, the current president, and where we are right now? Irene's reply was immediate. August 12th, Tulsa, Oklahoma. In your office, where my daughter-in-law thinks she can call me incompetent. Dr. Porter hid a smile behind her clipboard. Noted. The testing continued, but it was no contest. Irene's near-photographic memory served her like steel armor. She recited passages from letters she'd digitized with Ruth, described in detail quilts she had sewn 20 years ago, and solved logic puzzles with unhurried precision. When it was over, Dr. Porter closed the file with a decisive snap. Mrs. Calloway, she said, you've scored nearly perfect, higher in fact than most people 20 years younger. There's nothing here to suggest diminished capacity. Irene slipped her glasses back on, voice even. I didn't think there would be. 2 days later, Eric Banner strode into Tulsa County Court with a thick folder under his arm. His suit was crisp, his expression calm but edged with quiet amusement. He placed the affidavit and test results before the judge without flourish. The judge, a seasoned man with tired eyes, scanned the documents. His gavel tapped once against the bench. Mrs. Calloway is clearly competent. Petition denied. He glanced toward Amber, seated stiffly beside Bryce. And let this serve as a warning. Abuse of process will not be tolerated in my courtroom. Amber's face burned red, her lips pressed so tightly they blanched. Bryce stared at his hands, unable to meet his mother's eyes. Irene didn't gloat. She simply sat straighter, her pearls gleaming under the courtroom lights. Outside, reporters waited. The courthouse steps bustled with cameras and microphones thrust forward. Irene paused at the top of the stairs, then gave them a small smile. Not wide, not theatrical, just enough. The shutters clicked rapidly, freezing her calm into headlines by afternoon. Seamstress beats challenge to will. Legacy stands strong. When she arrived home, Ruth was waiting with a bakery box and a bottle of champagne. She set them down on the kitchen counter with a flourish. For a woman who just knocked Amber flat in court. The cupcakes were vanilla with buttercream swirls, and the champagne cork popped with a satisfying crack. The kitchen filled with the scent of sugar, and the fizz of bubbles, a sharp contrast to the sterile courtroom air. Irene raised her glass only halfway. One battle won. Ruth clinked hers against it anyway. And one very public loss for the opposition. Cheers. That evening, long after the laughter had faded, and the champagne bottle lay empty in the sink, a knock rattled Ruth's front door. She shuffled over, wiping her hands on her apron, expecting a neighbor. But when she opened it, Bryce Calloway stood there, shoulders slumped, tie undone, eyes shadowed with defeat. His eyes darted past Ruth into the house, searching for the only person who could anchor him. Ruth didn't move. She crossed her arms. "You look like hell, Bryce. I need to talk to her," he said, voice hoarse. Ruth hesitated, then jerked her head toward the back room. "She's here. Don't waste her time." Irene sat in Ruth's sunroom, the late afternoon light catching on the quilting frame beside her. The scent of lavender oil drifted faintly from a diffuser, but Bryce's arrival cut through the calm like smoke in a closed room. His voice cracked. "Please, we need to talk." Irene didn't look up from the square of fabric in her hands. She folded it neatly before setting it aside. Only then did she meet his eyes. "You've made changes," he rushed on. "The will, the trust. Amber told me everything. You don't understand what this is doing to us. You've cut me off." Her gaze stayed steady, unreadable. "What did you do while she lit the fire?" The words landed with a weight that knocked the air out of him. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Mom, I didn't think she'd actually." "You watched." Irene interrupted, her voice calm, measured. "You sat there while she burned your father's memory, and you did nothing." Bryce's hands trembled at his sides. He stepped forward, voice rising. "I was trying to keep the peace. You know how she gets when she's—" Irene lifted her palm, silencing him. "Excuses. That's all I hear." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that." "You already chose your side," Irene said. Her words weren't loud, but they were final, as if etched into glass. She reached into her bag and pulled out a crisp envelope. Inside was a bound copy of the final trust, notarized and sealed. She slid it across the table to him. "This is the truth now," she said. "Read it or don't. It changes nothing." Bryce stared at the document as though it might burn him, then closed his hand around it. His lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. His shoulders sagged. When he turned, the sound of his shoes on Ruth's tile was heavy, uneven. He left without a word, the door clicking shut with more weight than a slam could carry. That night, Irene sat alone in her living room, the quiet thick as wool. She replayed the encounter in her mind, not with anger but with a hollow ache that pressed against her chest. She had lost her son long before the fire pit, but today the truth had crystallized. The phone on the side table buzzed, startling her. An unknown number flashed on the screen. For a moment she considered ignoring it. Then, with deliberate slowness, she answered. A man's voice, low and cautious, came through the line. "Mrs. Calloway? Yes. I thought you should know. Amber's been selling things, personal things, online." Irene's grip tightened on the receiver. "What kind of things?" There was a pause. Then the man spoke again, almost apologetic. "Family pieces, jewelry, keepsakes, items that don't belong to her. She's listing them under different names, but it's her. People around here talk." The line clicked off before she could ask more. Irene sat motionless, the hum of the dial tone filling the room. Her eyes shifted toward the shelves where her husband's watchbox should have been. The space looked emptier than she remembered. For the first time that evening, her pulse quickened. Amber hadn't just burned what was visible, she was stealing what was hidden. The photographs flickered across Trina Park's laptop screen, blurry images posted under a stranger's name, but the items were unmistakable. "That's your locket," Trina whispered, enlarging the photo. The gold pendant gleamed even in poor lighting, engraved with Harold Calloway's initials. She clicked again, pulling up another listing. "And that's no estate sale find. That's a Depression-era quilt. Yours." Irene stood behind her, arms folded, her expression a wall of steel. The boutique smelled faintly pressed fabric and lavender sachets, yet the air inside felt charged, humming with betrayal. "She's not even trying to hide it," Trina said, disgust in her voice. "Look at this, same staging, same curtain in the background. She's practically advertising from her own bedroom." Irene's lips pressed into a thin line. She always mistakes arrogance for intelligence. Back home, Irene sat at her desk, and printed each listing, stacking them into a growing pile of evidence. Her hands moved without hesitation, though her chest tightened with every new sheet. She'd once folded those quilts for safekeeping, tucked away with cedar chips. Now they sat tagged with "Buy Now" buttons, cheapened to commodity. She dialed Eric Banner's office. "It's Irene. She's selling things that never belonged to her." Within the hour, Eric called back. His tone was measured but sharp, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "I've already drafted a cease and desist. It'll hit her inbox before dinner. If she ignores it, we escalate." "Escalate how?" Irene asked. "Civil theft, fraud, conversion, you name it. Judges don't look kindly on opportunists who ransack widows' homes." That evening, Bryce appeared uninvited at Irene's kitchen table, his voice already frayed. "Amber didn't mean to. She thought some of those things were hers. She didn't know." Irene set a teacup down with deliberate care, the porcelain clinking lightly against the saucer. "Your father's locket? My mother's quilt? She didn't know?" Bryce ran his hands through his hair, frustrated. "She's impulsive. She does things without thinking. But you're overreacting, Mom. It's just stuff." The calm in Irene's face darkened. "Stuff doesn't carry 3 generations of hands. Stuff doesn't hold a husband's heartbeat. Don't reduce my life to clutter." Bryce flinched but said nothing more. Later that night, Ruth stormed in after seeing the listings herself. She slapped the stack of printouts on the table. "Enough. You can't just let Eric play whack-a-mole with cease and desists. You need a police report." Irene hesitated, her fingers brushing the top page. Ruth leaned closer, her voice low and sharp. "You've given Amber too many chances to show her teeth. Time to bite back." The next morning, Irene walked into the police station with the folder under her arm. The officer at the desk, a young man with tired eyes, listened as she laid out each item, each photograph, each theft. By the end, his pen had carved deep lines into his notepad. "We'll send someone by," he assured her. True to his word, a patrol car pulled into Amber's driveway that afternoon. Neighbors lingered on porches as the officer walked up, clipboard in hand. Through the window, Amber's figure darted back and forth, her gestures sharp and frantic. Bryce trailed behind her, pleading, but the officer remained firm. Boxes emerged from the house, frames, jewelry, folded fabrics, handed over with reluctant, jerky motions. Amber's face was scarlet, her eyes flashing with venom. From across the street, Ruth and Irene watched from Ruth's Buick. Ruth muttered, "If looks could kill." Irene's gaze never wavered. "She's already tried." That evening, the quiet of Irene's porch was shattered. A porcelain frame, hurled with vicious force, exploded against the bricks, shards scattered across the steps, catching the last light of sunset like tiny knives. Amber's shadow lingered at the end of the walkway, chest heaving before she disappeared into the night. The shards glittered across the porch like a constellation scattered on stone. Irene opened the door slowly, the cool night air carrying the faint tang of porcelain dust, mixed with the damp scent of summer grass. She didn't flinch. She simply stepped forward, broom in hand, and began sweeping. Each stroke of the bristles against brick whispered in the silence. No cursing, no trembling, just the steady rhythm of control. The broken photo frame had once held her wedding picture, the same one Amber had grabbed in her fury. Its glass now lay in fragments, but the photograph itself, bent but not destroyed, rested safely on the porch rail. Ruth arrived minutes later, headlights cutting across the yard. She slammed her car door, fists clenched. "Irene, she's crossed the damn line." "She crossed it months ago," Irene murmured, sliding the last pieces of glass into a dustpan. Ruth stormed inside, her phone already in hand. Within 10 minutes, she had pulled up Irene's porch security footage, clear, irrefutable images of Amber hurling the frame against the house, rage written all over her face. Ruth tapped the screen. "This is gold. I'll send it to the police myself." By the next afternoon, a citation was filed. Amber Calloway, fined and issued a formal warning for vandalism. It wasn't jail time, but it was paper official, public, permanent. Ruth delivered the news with a grin sharp as scissors. She thought she could play the part of a respectable wife while smashing heirlooms at midnight. Now she's got a record. Irene only nodded, her composure unshaken. Later that evening, her phone buzzed with a new message. Bryce's name lit the screen. "Mom, I'm sorry." She lost her temper. "It won't happen again." Irene stared at the words, the apology as hollow as an empty drawer. With a single flick of her thumb, she deleted it. No reply, no record left behind. The following week, preparations for the scholarship gala filled Trina's boutique. Racks of gowns stood ready for display, mannequins dressed in Irene's restored pieces. In the back room, Trina carefully laid out the damaged wedding photo. Its edges were creased, but the image, Harold's proud smile, Irene's youthful gaze, remained intact. "I thought this deserved better than another frame from the department store," Trina said. She revealed a new frame she had commissioned, oak polished to a deep sheen, lined with protective glass, sealed against fire and weather. Together they slid the photograph inside. When the glass locked into place with a soft click, Irene's shoulders loosened. She touched the edge with reverence. "Unburnable now." Trina smiled gently. "Exactly. It'll be the centerpiece at the gala." On the night of the event, the framed photo stood at the entrance, elevated on a velvet-draped stand. Guests paused as they entered, drawn first to the image, then to the plaque beneath it. "Harold and Irene Calloway, 1969. Legacy preserved." Irene stood nearby, the lights casting her shadow across the wall. She watched strangers admire what Amber had tried to destroy. Not ashes, not ruin, preservation. The gala buzzed with laughter, glasses clinking, the scent of roses and champagne heavy in the air. Ruth leaned close, whispering in Irene's ear, "See, every time she tries to shatter you, you come back under glass." Irene allowed the faintest smile. "And glass can be stronger than fire." As the gala wound down and guests trickled out into the humid Tulsa night, Irene's phone rang. She stepped away from the crowd, answering quietly. "Irene," Eric's calm voice carried through the line. "One question for you." She waited. "Would you like to donate the fire pit for repurposing?" The morning they came to tear it out, the backyard smelled like wet soil and sun-warmed brick. A crew of landscapers stood in a loose circle around the old fire pit, shovels and wheelbarrows at the ready. The pit was nothing more than a ring of scorched stone now, its charred basin blackened with soot and memory. Irene stood on the porch, arms folded, while Ruth clutched a mug of coffee beside her. "You sure you don't want to take a sledgehammer to it yourself?" Ruth asked. Irene shook her head, her lips pressed into the faintest smile. "Some things aren't worth touching twice." When the first hammer cracked into the stone, Ruth whooped with laughter, startling the workers. Irene allowed herself a low chuckle too, short, dry, but real. Each strike broke apart not just rock, but months of tension lodged inside her chest. The pit that had consumed her dress, her silence, her patience collapsed piece by piece, until nothing but rubble remained. By afternoon, a new frame had taken its place, fresh timber raised, soil turned, and rows of rose bushes carefully planted. The workers wiped their brows, stepping back as the new garden began to take shape. Pale pink blooms opened in the late summer sun, their scent mingling with the earthy musk of tilled dirt. At the edge, a small stone marker was placed, carved with two simple words, "Calloway Grove." Ruth read it aloud, her voice catching just slightly. "Better than any damn fire pit." Irene stood straighter, inhaling the rose's perfume. "My name will never be attached to ashes again." 2 weeks later, the scholarship gala glittered in downtown Tulsa, chandeliers blazing against polished marble floors. The hall brimmed with donors, students, and reporters eager to document the seamstress whose story had become local legend. Tables overflowed with flowers, champagne glasses clinked, and Irene's framed wedding photo shone under a spotlight by the entrance. Amber appeared in the crowd that night, wrapped in a sleek cocktail dress, her hair styled like she belonged. She tried to step past the velvet rope at the door, lips curved in a forced smile, but the event coordinator stopped her with a practiced gesture. Mrs. Calloway's guest list is final. Amber's face froze, her composure cracking as whispers spread around her. Do you know who I am? She hissed. Everyone knows, the coordinator said coolly. That's why you're not welcome. Security guided her out into the night, her heels clicking furiously against the marble steps. Cameras captured her departure just as brightly as they had Irene's entrance. Meanwhile, Bryce was spotted elsewhere at Trina's boutique, head bowed, his cufflinks glinting under fluorescent light. He placed them on the counter, eyes downcast. Trina picked them up, recognizing the engraved initials. These were your father's. Bryce muttered, we need the money. The clink of metal on glass echoed through the shop. For Trina, it was confirmation Bryce had already sold pieces of legacy that weren't his to give away. She didn't say a word. She simply rang it up, her expression unreadable, while Bryce shuffled out into the August heat. Back at the gala, Irene took the podium. Her voice was low, steady, amplified through crystal-clear speakers. This fund began from loss. But legacy isn't about what we bury, it's about what we choose to grow. Tonight, I stand in Calloway Grove, surrounded by roses instead of ashes. That is where my family name will live. Applause thundered through the hall, echoing against marble and glass. When she stepped down, a donor in a tailored suit approached her. Mrs. Calloway, he said warmly, extending his hand, I'd like to match your fund, dollar for dollar. Let's make sure your name grows far beyond Tulsa. Ruth squeezed Irene's arm. Well, look at that, you're contagious. The night ended in triumph, but the next morning brought a new ripple of consequence. Word spread quickly through Tulsa's tight-knit business community. Amber Calloway had been evicted from her boutique lease. Official notice taped to her storefront window read vacated due to reputation damage. The studio smelled of starch, new fabric, and the faint metallic tang of sewing machines in motion. Light spilled through wide windows, illuminating bolts of cloth stacked neatly on shelves and mannequins draped in gowns half complete. A banner stretched across the wall in bold navy letters. The Calloway Studio for Textile Arts. Irene stepped through the doorway, cane tapping lightly on the polished floor, Ruth at her side with a video camera balanced on her shoulder. The hum of activity slowed as students noticed the woman whose name crowned their space. One by one, they brought forward their work. A girl in braids lifted a gown with flowing sleeves, its seams finished in tiny, exact stitches. A boy presented a jacket lined with intricate embroidery, patterns echoing the kind Irene had once drafted late into the night. Their voices carried nervous excitement, hands brushing fabric as though it were gold. We studied your techniques, one student explained shyly. The way you layered stabilizers, how you reinforced hems without weight. Irene touched the gown, fingers moving over the fabric with reverence. You honored the work, she said simply. Her eyes glimmered, though no tears fell. Midway through the tour, Trina appeared at the back of the room, a long box in her arms. Ruth abandoned the camera to help her carry it forward. Together they opened the lid and lifted out a sash, handmade from vintage lace, stitched together from remnants Irene herself had donated. Trina's voice caught. We wanted you to have something no fire could touch. This lace has lived through decades, and now it lives again. They draped the sash across Irene's shoulders. It was light, airy, cool against her neck. For a moment she closed her eyes, breathing in the faint cedar and lavender embedded in its fibers. When she opened them again, her voice was steady. This is the only fabric that ever mattered. Ruth lowered her camera, her sarcasm set aside for once. Perfect line. That's going in the documentary. Later, in a quiet office overlooking the studio, Eric Banner laid out the latest trust documents. His fountain pen gleamed under the desk lamp. These updates, he explained, make your name untouchable. The Calloway Fund, the studio, the scholarships, they're all insulated. No one can strip them, challenge them, or tarnish them. Your legacy will move forward untouched for generations. Irene signed each page with her familiar composure, the pen scratched against paper, binding not just her assets but her name into permanence. When she finished, she set the pen down and glanced toward the window, where students bent over sewing tables, laughter spilling through the glass. For the first time in months, the weight in her chest lifted, not gone, but transformed. Ruth captured it all. The smiles, the laughter, the silent nod. Irene exchanged with a young designer who looked at her as though she were royalty. Hours of footage filled her camera, Irene adjusting a student's stitch with the same precision she once used on bridal hems, Trina bustling in the background, Eric watching with quiet pride. "This isn't just a documentary," Ruth whispered as she packed her camera away. "This is proof. Proof you won." Irene said nothing, only brushed her fingers over the lace sash at her shoulders, grounding herself in its texture. Back home that evening, the sun dipped low, staining the sky orange and violet. Irene lowered herself into her armchair, the sash still draped across her. The house smelled faintly of roses from the garden, their blooms reaching through the open windows. On the side table, a stack of mail waited. She sorted it with practiced efficiency. Flyers, a catalog, a handwritten envelope with her name scrawled in uneven ink. She paused, holding it up to the light. The return address made her breath still. Amber Calloway. Ruth, standing nearby, frowned. "What is it?" Irene slit the envelope with her letter opener. Inside was a single page. Words rushed, frantic. "Irene, I know I've wronged you. I know I don't deserve anything. But I'm pregnant. I'm desperate. Please forgive me. For the baby's sake, if not for mine." The paper trembled faintly in Irene's hand, though her expression revealed nothing. The letter trembled only because the air from the ceiling fan caught its edges. Irene's hands were still, her face unreadable as she read the lines again. Amber's rushed script, jagged and desperate, asking for forgiveness, not for herself, but for the child she now carried. She folded the paper once, twice, then laid it flat on the coffee table. The house was quiet but charged, as if the walls themselves waited for her verdict. Ruth found her that way, seated with her lace sash across her shoulders, the letter lying like a wound on the table. What did she do now? Irene didn't answer. She rose steady as stone and slipped the envelope into her handbag. "Walk with me." The park by the lake smelled of cut grass and damp earth. Geese drifted lazily on the water, their reflections rippling in the late afternoon sun. Irene and Ruth walked side by side down the gravel path, the crunch beneath their shoes the only sound between them. Ruth, impatient as always, broke the silence first. "She's begging, isn't she? Probably wants a second chance at your estate. She never quits." Still, Irene said nothing. Her eyes stayed on the water, where sunlight glittered in fractured shards across the surface. The breeze tugged gently at her hair, lifting wisps around her face. They reached a bench overlooking the lake. Irene sat, her spine straight, and pulled the letter from her bag. Ruth leaned in, reading quickly. Her mouth twisted. "Pregnant," Ruth muttered. "Of course now she thinks she can crawl back in under the halo of motherhood. Classic." Irene folded the page again, slower this time, tucking it neatly back into the envelope. She placed it in her lap, her expression giving nothing away. "You're not going soft on her?" Ruth pressed. "No," Irene said, her voice finally breaking the silence. It was quiet, level, but resolute. The next morning, Irene sat at her desk. The typewriter she hadn't used in years waited at the edge, its keys gleaming faintly in the sunlight that poured through lace curtains. She fed in a single sheet of paper, her fingers struck with deliberate rhythm. One line, and one line only. "Teach your child what you refuse to learn." She removed the page, folded it crisply, and slid it into a plain envelope, with no return address, the stamp pressed firm under her thumb. When she placed it in the mailbox at the corner of the street, the sound of the metal door closing was final, like the seal of a coffin. Days later, Eric Banner arrived at her home, with a fresh stack of papers. His eyes flicked briefly to the garden blooming outside, the roses bright, the fire pit gone, before he set the documents on her dining table. "This is the last update," he said. "A full exclusion clause. Ironclad. No appeals, No loopholes. Even if Amber tries to leverage the pregnancy, the court won't budge. Your estate will go only where you choose. Irene signed each page with her usual composure. No hesitation. The pen glided smoothly, her name anchoring the future in black ink. Eric slid the folder back into his briefcase, nodding once. It's done. When he left, Irene walked to her sitting room. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, scattering soft patterns across the floor. She lifted the sash Ruth and Trina had given her, holding it up to the light. Every stitch caught the sun, like tiny threads of fire, glowing but untouchable. She draped it across her shoulders again, and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt the fabric of her life was no longer unraveling but rewoven. That evening, as she sipped tea by the window, her email pinged with a new message. The subject line read, "Capstone Interview Request." Curious, Irene opened it. "Mrs. Calloway, my name is Emily Carter. I'm a senior in textile studies at the university. My project is called Unraveled and Rewritten, and it's about legacies rebuilt from loss. May I interview you for my capstone?" Irene's teacup hovered midair, her lips pressed together, unreadable. The student arrived on a windy Saturday afternoon, clutching a notebook so full its pages bowed outward. Her voice trembled slightly as she introduced herself. "Emily Carter, Senior, Capstone Project on Legacy and Reclamation." She set a recorder on the coffee table, its tiny red light glowing, and asked if Irene was comfortable sharing her story. Irene sat in her armchair, lace sash draped over her shoulders, hands folded neatly in her lap. "If I wasn't," she said softly, "I would have shut the door." The questions began cautiously, about Irene's childhood, her first stitches, the day she sewed her own wedding gown. As the afternoon stretched on, the student's hand cramped from writing, but Irene never faltered. Her words came measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of decades. "Grief isn't the absence of love," Irene said at one point. "It's the proof of it, and if someone tries to burn that proof, you don't hand them matches. You build stronger walls." Emily's eyes shone. "And that's what the fund became. That's what I became," Irene replied. Weeks later, Emily sent her the draft thesis. Its title was bold, handwritten across the first page, "Unraveled and Rewritten." The chapters interwove Irene's interviews with research on women's textile legacies, turning her life into both history and warning. Ruth read it over Irene's shoulder and snorted. "Kid writes like a poet. I can't believe you let her make you sound this noble." Irene smirked faintly. "Perhaps she sees what you refuse to say." On the morning of the defense presentation, Emily invited Irene to attend. The classroom buzzed with nerves, the air thick with chalk dust and coffee. When Emily reached the section on Irene, she projected photographs, the Calloway Grove roses, the studio bearing Irene's name, the restored wedding photo under glass. "She told me," Emily read aloud, "fabric can burn, but legacies can be rewoven if you have the spine for it." The panel nodded, visibly moved. Irene, sitting quietly in the back row, adjusted her sash and watched as her story was stitched into scholarship. That same evening, Ruth arrived with a large wrapped bundle. She dragged it through the doorway with exaggerated huffing. "Don't get excited. It's not diamonds." Irene arched an eyebrow. "You'd faint before spending that much." Ruth laughed and tore the paper away, revealing a quilt unlike any Irene had seen. Each square was a replica of patterns she had once sewn: sunburst fans, log cabins, wedding rings, stitched with vintage fabric Ruth had hunted down from estate sales. "It's your life," Ruth said simply, laying it across the back of the sofa. "Every piece, but safer now." For the first time, Irene's composure cracked. She reached out, smoothing the quilt's surface, her fingers trembling against the familiar shapes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Damn right," Ruth said gruffly, blinking a little too quickly. Irene chose to hang the quilt in her sitting room, right where her dress had once been stored before the fire. The colors glowed in the afternoon sun, transforming the room into something alive, something layered with memory. Every time she passed, She touched a square, as if counting stitches in prayer. Meanwhile, Trina unveiled a new display in her boutique. At its center stood a mannequin, dressed in one of Irene's most striking gowns, restored and altered for permanence. Beside it, a plaque read, "Survivor, Matriarch, Seamstress." Customers stopped to take photos, some leaving flowers at the base, as if the dress were more monument than garment. Trina sent Irene a picture of the display, captioned, "She'll never touch this one." On a quiet evening, not long after, Irene sat in her chair, the quilt behind her, the sash across her shoulders, and the framed wedding photo under glass nearby. She studied the image of her younger self, the girl who had sewn her own gown in a rented apartment, who had stepped into a life she could never have imagined would end like this. Her reflection wavered faintly against the glass. She smiled, not bitter, not triumphant, but steady. She set fire to fabric. Irene murmured, voice carrying softly through the room. "I rewrote the future in steel thread.